Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World Centre Speaker Series. My name is Philip Gooding and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Ocean World Centre based here in Montreal, Canada. Like the 4 sessions from this semester that we have already held, today's event is being recorded, at least until the end of the presentation itself. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A session, but we'll stop the recording beforehand. The recording will then be uploaded to the IWC's YouTube channel. Speaking of today's presentation, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Dr. Klara Winkler. Dr. Winkler is currently the Deputy Science Director of the NSERC Strategic Network, ResNet, and a trained sustainability scientist interested in human-nature relationships and processes of sustainable transformation. She uses a governance perspective to research these phenomena on multiple levels of social ecological systems, from local to supranational. With her research, Dr. Winkler aims to better understand how actions of individuals fit into the broader network of societal activities and how they relate to and affect each other. Working landscapes in highly developed countries are the focus of her research, as they are the places where change is urgently needed in order to provide a stable ecological system that can contribute to human and well-being today and in the future. Her presentation today is entitled Understanding Human-Nature Relationships for Transformations Towards Sustainability. Professor Winkler, thank you very much for agreeing to present today in our speaker series. I now hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Welcome to everybody who joins this call today and everybody who watches later. Let's see that we see, I'm sharing my screen. Can I get a thumbs up if, yeah, I see the thumbs up. So thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be with you here. And I want to talk today, as said, about human-nature relationships. And the first part of my talk will be on the topic of sustainability science, just to introduce you to sustainability science. And then I will show some research that I was part of and where the frontiers are at the moment in this thinking about human-nature relationships for sustainable transformation. But I would like to begin with acknowledging that McGill University is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Kanakaaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and borders on which McGill is located. And Tiohtià:ke, which we often call Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. And I came to Canada in 2018, 3.5 years ago. And when I heard the first land acknowledgements, I did not know what this means, an unceded indigenous land. And so I always want to highlight this, that unceded indigenous lands, the lands where McGill is based, this are territories that were never signed away by indigenous peoples who inhabited in these areas since time immemorial. And I want to give you a moment to think about this fact and our research and our luck to be in these places. Let me start with sustainability. I said I'm a sustainability scientist, and sustainability is an absolute buzzword in our societies. And in Canada, we find so many examples of sustainability. If you look, the federal government has websites on sustainability and the federal sustainable development strategy, but also big companies like CN do something sustainably. They are part of the Dow Jones Sustainability World Index. The NHL publishes sustainability reports and has this idea of the green NHL. And last, also McGill has an Office for Sustainability, Moose, called. If you're not familiar with them, you should check out their website. They do a lot of projects, very concrete, but they also support research, especially of students. And McGill has a climate and sustainability strategy. At the moment, the strategy goes until 2025. So yes, sustainability is a real buzzword here in Canada in all parts of our lives. But it's not only in Canada, right? It's a global topic. And acknowledging this on a global level the UN has agreed on the Sustainability Development Goals, the SDGs, and I'm sure many of you have seen them, heard about them. It's 17 targets that cover topics all the way from poverty and hunger to more topics like climate, life under the water and on Earth, on the land. So you can see how big the topic is, like everything is somehow covered. In the 17 targets, we find 232 unique indicators to measure these targets. And we have started measuring our progress because we want to reach, as a world society, the nations have signed up to reach these goals in 2030. And we have started measuring them. And here you see the dashboard for Canada. So we see again all 17 goals, and I'm sorry for the people who are colorblind. The takeaway is only the education SDG is reached in Canada, and all the other SDGs, including the climate and life on Earth, are in a really bad state. There's major challenges remaining. And what the arrows indicate is how well we are doing in it, like going forward, that we have until 2030 to achieve them. And we see there is progress being made in Canada on many topics. Unfortunately, many on the environmental topics, more the biosphere concerning, the progress is not as fast, and decisions like the government had yesterday might not necessarily contribute to the climate action that Canada is doing. And we see other countries, and I picked here Madagascar, they are in a much more severe state, right? Most of their SDGs are in a color where major challenges remain. And somehow, ironically, Madagascar has reached, for example, already the climate goal, but we can imagine that this comes on the cost of all the other aspects that have not been reached. So the takeaway here is that sustainability covers a lot. It's a lot of different aspects. And so I like this quote, which is almost 10 years old already, from The Guardian, where they said sustainability is a bit like Sudoku for hippies. It is complex, dynamic, and challenging, like an ultimate Earth puzzle that needs solving. And these are ideas that we are grappling with every day. These complex systems, they are dynamic, they are challenging. There's not an easy solution. But one thing we are very sure, it is us humans. And the term anthropocene was coined by Paul Crutzen in 2002. Paul Crutzen won the Nobel Prize as well. And he said the Anthropocene is an epoch where humans dominate biological, chemical, and geological processes. So in previous times, it was not the humans that changed everything, but nowadays it is. And I see there are some people, so maybe you can write in the chat what you think this is. What do you see in this, on this picture? Has nothing to do with my research, but I think it's a very prime example of what we see, what at the Anthropocene is. Any ideas what this could be? Logging roads, dried up rivers. Yeah. Yeah, so you can see a little bit in the little corner. I almost cut it off. It's in Canada. It's a part of the Côte Nord here in Quebec. Hydro dams. Yeah, it is. It's logging areas, as a matter of fact. So we see, as Jackie found out, these are logging roads. So the logging companies come and create these roads, and then they harvest all the trees. And so while indigenous communities have lived in this area since ever, they harvested and there were fires, but never to this scale. And so logging companies come and they just harvest the forest and keep these little boundaries. And that's how the landscape in certain areas look like. And these are just normal lakes. These lakes are not dammed, but could be too. we change the biological systems as well. So while we are sure that it's the humans, sustainability science has tried to understand what is happening and how can we change that for about the last 20 years. And in 2011, a paper was published that talked about sustainability science and as the science that is aiming to solve a problem, the sustainability problem. And thus it's also a normative choice. We are aware, we are not just observing the world, we are interested in sustainability and why the world is going in a certain direction and how we could change it. And so the authors of this paper, they identify 3 core themes of sustainability. And the first one is a scientific understanding in a very, maybe the most classic science perspective, and ideas like the IPCC reports on changing temperatures and precipitation are a classic example where we look into the future and how precipitation and temperatures are changing. Other examples are our research on degrading biodiversity and loss of biodiversity and species at a rate that we have hardly seen, and we know it's because of the humans. And then there's other ideas like the planetary boundaries, which also show that in certain area, like here we see again the biodiversity loss, we are way beyond what the planet Earth can keep up for a longer time. So this is the scientific understanding that we talk about, that certain sustainability scientists create. And then people talk about the sustainability goals, and one outcome are the sustainability development goals by the UN, but we can think of goals also on all other levels, influenced by the SDGs, but also other aspects. Where do we want to go? What's the goal? What would be sustainable? And the last part is sustainability pathways, strategies, and implementation. And that's the part where my research falls under. This is the theme I contribute with my research to. So we will talk later in the second half about research that contributes to these ideas of pathways, strategies, and implementation. And one of these ideas, how sustainability pathways happen, that's very popular in sustainability science, comes from systems thinking, from an idea called leverage points. And a systems thinker, Donella Meadows, promoted this idea of leverage points, of points where we can intervene and the system starts changing. And we can see 4 groups, 4 themes that describe these leverage points. And the first one is materials. So where we alter rewards and how materials flow. And the second one would be changing feedbacks. And I come in a second with some examples, because this is all very theoretical. What does it mean to change a feedback in a system? We can think about, okay, one part influences the other and gives feedback, but what does it mean in the real world? And the third one is then when we redefine goals, when we change the direction we are looking, and when we get other information and organize differently. And the last is changing mindsets and paradigms in which we act. That's the biggest change we can do. And so I brought to you some examples coming out of agriculture, because I studied a lot of agricultural systems. So an example for this changing materials is subsidies, especially in the European Union. There's a lot of subsidies paid to incentivize farmers to act in a certain way. And we find subsidies, financial influences in all kinds of ways. So a farmer would change their farming techniques or like their aims and goals, because they get paid for it. It makes economic sense. As soon as you take away the subsidy, the farmer might decide to do something else again. So there's not a big change necessarily in the underlying assumptions of a farmer. Then processes, when we change feedback. And for example, precision farming. So using a lot of technology, modern technology in farming to understand where do we have seeded everything, what's the soil quality, the soil moisture, and then working with these parameters is an example, a very temporary example changing the feedbacks could work. And when we think about, okay, so to design the goals, an example would be CSA baskets, so community supported agriculture. When you sign up, and there's CSA concepts where you sign up in the beginning of the season, you might even pay it the whole money for the whole season. So the farmer know they have the money, no matter how the season is weather tech, like for the weather or similar, but also you work directly with the farmer. You might get a newsletter via email, for example, and the whole food industry, supermarkets are cut out. So we start changing how we get information and how we organize in the food system. And an example for changing mindsets would be, for example, if we start changing the whole idea about how do we do agriculture, what's the ambition? Is it to produce as much food as cheap as possible? Or do we want to keep certain species, a diversity of cranes, for example? So this is just examples from the agriculture, but we could think about it in energy, transportation, in any realm of life. And so going back to like in this, we can see that there is different levels of explanation and what is explained. And most sustainability interventions we see at the moment are in this part, which we call the shallow leverage points. They change a little bit, but they don't change really the roots. And so this is what we call the deep leverage points that have great potential, but they are under-researched. And one way to think was like some part of sustainability studies where we were like, what is this deeper change? What is this paradigms we need to change? And recently, research has oriented much more towards not only looking what we humans do, which are maybe often resulting in these interventions, changing the farmers' behavior by giving them money, but starting to think about our relationship with nature, with Earth. And so in 2020, there was a paper talking about the nature's role in society and being this essential core part of sustainability science. And this is a very complicated figure. I debated long if I keep it or not, but we see this is the nature society interactions. They are in the center of sustainability science. This is a research frontier which we try to understand more and more. And we try to understand the interactions and then how we can socially determine goals that help us reaching a more sustainable society with this understanding what the interaction between us and nature is. And so this is the perspective of sustainability science and where we are at the moment. And there's another field who has researched nature and somewhat people, and that's ecology. And so we find a lot of ecologists also contributing to sustainability science. And we can see over time how we see nature and humans has changed, especially in ecology. So first, when we go back to the 1960s and 70s, the idea was to keep nature for itself. Ideas where we see in certain national parks in certain countries, like keep nature to itself and exclude humans, right? Like the exclusion or even the resettlement of certain communities out of national parks. There was about nature. And then we had this idea of nature despite people. So people did things in nature, but we kept nature somehow in there. So there's ideas where we worked on ideas like pollution and overexploitation. We became aware of them. It was like the humans using nature. So, and then we used it even more, but then we thought, okay, nature is now for us. It brings us a benefit. And environmental economics really got more and more power, and ideas of ecosystem services, economic value of nature, often connected with pollination, for example, what we often hear, that came. And only very recently, we start talking about human and nature and how we need to see it together rather than individuals, or one serving the other or one influencing the other. And so this is really what informs then big frameworks that I'm using as a sustainability scientist, but also ecologists are using. And here we see the IPES framework. So IPES is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They are kind of the counterpart to IPCC, which works on climate change, and IPES works on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they have this framework where they say, okay, there is something for humans called the quality of life, and then there is nature, and how are they connected? And when I said sustainability is complex, that's what we will see in this framework, that there's many, many parts. It's not just one arrow. So there's one thing, that nature somehow contributes to our lives with things that we go out in nature for hiking, but also produces the food and purifies the air for us. And often you hear the term ecosystem services. And there's this language thing where we have multiple terms for the same thing. And ecosystem services is a term that's often used. And I have, for example, published a lot with the term ecosystem services. But then also there's institutions, so it's rules, how we as a societies govern all of this. So this is then an influence on nature and on these nature contributions to people. But for sure, there's natural drivers like climate. The climate is also driving how nature develops. And there's these anthropocenic assets where things like infrastructure and knowledge and technology is grouped. So it's really complicated, and you see how many different parts you have to look at. And to complexify things, we also have to see always to these systems from two parts. And one is the context-specific perspective. So depending where you are, you might have a certain view, and we will see in a second what I mean with that. But then there's also these generalized perspectives, and they are often not matching 100%. Context-specific is often connected to certain knowledges that you cannot just measure. In a context of indigenous peoples, we talk about indigenous knowledge often, right? But we also can talk about local knowledge. It doesn't need to be indigenous knowledge. If anywhere you go in the world, the people who live somewhere have a certain knowledge and perspective on the land that you might not see from a very super, like, high up level. So, in my research, to which I come now, I will show you some research I did on this context-specific perspectives and on these generalized perspectives, which is this governance policies. These are like generalizing perspectives, and how we maybe get these closer together so that they are not contrary, but more overlapping and contributing to sustainability. And so I want to start with this context-specific perspective, where I studied in 2016. We published this, so it's almost 10 years ago. We studied cultural ecosystem services, which are ecosystem services, so benefits that are less tangible. And we used 12 in vineyard landscapes. So we have this idea of the physical and experiential interactions. If you go hiking in a vineyard landscape or you do a wine tasting, then there's these intellectual and representative cultural services where you just see, okay, this in certain areas, it's a big heritage to be wine producing. There is an aesthetic part about it. If you go to Sonoma in California, it's a very big tourism industry. There is science, and also there's tours where you can learn about it. There are like more the spiritual and emblematic perspectives on wine and vineyards. And last, there are the quasi-intrinsic perspectives. These services are grouped in the framework we used in this rainbow, and we studied two parts it was part of a bigger EU project We studied once in southern England. We looked at an emerging industry because based on soil type and climate prediction, wine is really or could be a very upcoming crop to produce, which produce high value crops. And we compared it to California, to Sonoma Valley, where it's a long-standing industry with a high tourism factor around it. So what we could find is that the local context shapes the relationship of the people. So we produced these these graphs, which are really complex to see. So I want to just highlight here one part, and that's heritage. And that's not very surprising what we found here, that wine producers in England didn't value heritage much. So the smaller the cake piece, the less important, versus people in California valued wine production as a heritage. They said, yeah, that's important to us. And also how we interact personally matters. So when we compared the wine producers in California with the local residents in California, so if you are involved in working with the vineyard every day, or if you're just living in the area, maybe you work in another industry, we see that they value much more these fun and entertaining parts. Versus here we see that, for example, the entertainment for wine producers is not important at all. They even see it as a distraction. And the education, they saw education and this value for future generations. They really highlighted that part. And what we found then when we compared across cases again was that there is a fear of change. And so we compared the local residents in England, so the people who are not involved in this new industry, with wine producers, so the people who are working in the dominant landscape. And we asked them, so what would happen if this landscape changes a lot? So they are basically would be the losers of the change that might come. And we see that these heritage and symbolic values and these bequests and acceptance were both very high in these groups. And so this brought us together that people's relationship with natural environments are context and experience dependent. It depends in what context you're living that shows this, like right in England as an upcoming wine area versus California, which is which just basically is this wine area we studied. And then we have the wine producers versus the local residents. So this is a part how a rather old study by now, that how you can study people's relationships and see how different it is. And in a very recent study that I'm currently conducting we are looking who builds or who can build relationships with nature. And so we have started to analyze nature in Canada protected areas, and we did a visual analysis of websites in CEPAC parks here in Quebec. So these are the national parks on the Quebec level, provincial parks, if you want to say. And what we found is that, and we looked for non-white people represented on the websites and people with physical disabilities. And so the lines you see in this figure are the average in the Quebec population. Like this is, there's about 12% of non-white people in Quebec, and there's almost 10 people with physical disabilities registered in Quebec. And we found 13 of the 28 parks did not represent anyone in their pictures of non-white people or people with physical disabilities. And the parks we see here in the end, who were really the 4 parks with really high values for non-white people displayed in their photos, are parks in northern Quebec. So they're where we have a higher percentage of Indigenous people in the communities. And this brings us to this idea that, so okay, most visuals are not representatives of the Quebec society. And over the summer, we have a student working on the Canadian social survey to see how people in these different groups interact from in 2016, to think about like who can build these relationships with the landscapes, rather than thinking about, oh, if we survey a few people in every area, that represents everybody, but to start being a little bit more fine-grained and looking at groups that we often don't think about maybe as in the first place, because they don't have a like a role in the landscape necessarily, right? They are not the farmers, they are not working necessarily in an institute or anything with that. So who can build these relationships? And we see a big inequalities coming here. And so this was examples about where we look at context-specific perspectives and how people look at nature. And then about more the generalizing perspectives. And when we think about these pathways, how to implement, there's this idea of top down. And if there's any political scientists, I'm sorry here, I'm very much simplifying, but basically you have a government in a top down approach and they make a law or a rule, and then the individual has to act upon it. And we see that in Canada over and over again, like Canada has a plan to reach net zero, and created this Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act last year. And Justin Trudeau, just a few days ago, has a new Canada emissions reduction plan. And Canada has these carbon tax and cap and trade systems. But the government sets in rules and hopes with the rules, the behavior of individuals change. But the question is, how much is it just a rule, and how much do policies see this these multiple benefits rather than just looking for one, this broad, complex perspective on what we get? And we studied in a European context policies in the European Union and how much they integrated ecosystem services in this EU policy. And what we found was that the more recent, the more they're considering ecosystem services, but also that it's very much a topic for environmental policies. And we see that same for sustainability. It's often connected to the environment offices. So there is something where only certain groups are thinking about sustainability and the environment for the future. And a recent study in Canada has found this same, and even to a worse degree, where there's hardly any integration and thinking about this. And in Canada, compared to the European Union, in Canada, there is even a specific tool that could help policymakers to integrate this broader perspective that the government created about 5 years ago, or a little bit more. Environment Canada created. It's called the toolkit, but it still doesn't find any integration. And back on the European level, when we studied this in Europe, we talked with the people and like policymakers on the European level, and we really found that these human-nature relationships, they were not broadly considered because they didn't fit in the sectoral thinking. And so this might hinder achieving a sustainable transformation. You also saw when I linked this back to the Sustainable Development Goals, we have 17 goals, but they are very boxed, they are not related. So this thinking about, okay, I do now only climate, or I do only education, or I do only economic growth, that often doesn't allow a bigger change and seeing how humans relate to nature and how this special relationship has to be considered when we want to have bigger changes. So this is just a very quick overview of the governance aspects that we have studied, and we can talk about it later. And so really what is in my interest is like, is there a possibility to bring these context-specific perspectives and the generalizing perspectives closer together? And this figure, which I took from a 2018 publication, they have this arrow pointing right against each other, but is there a way to merge it together? And ideas of bottom-up might come up here. And so bottom-up is when we think about individuals and that they somehow work with the government or influence the government, and then law and rules can happen. And I did so these examples could be pollination, for example, when people, we find that all over the world, like people have started getting interested in bees and they started working with bees, having their own bees. And suddenly we see more and more popping up in society, laws that protect bees, for example. So that could be an example of how to influence this. Another example is people start thinking about, okay, maybe we have to think about individual behaviors, and can we then ask the government to do rules where, for example, transportation gets easier to be more sustainably. And last, we saw with the Fridays for Futures movement, how suddenly before the pandemic, we had this whole vibe where one individual started in Sweden, and then suddenly, I think it was 1 million here in Montreal when Greta Thunberg was here, like suddenly marched, and governments felt like they needed to react, and would have been an interesting experiment to see what happens if we didn't have moved into a global pandemic. So there is this idea that individuals could contribute to what the government wants. And during my PhD in Germany, I was part of a project on the East Frisian Peninsula. That's how much to the oceans I got. So this is here, like this is Germany. So it's in the northwest of Germany, this peninsula here, and this is how the landscape looks. It's flat, it's all reclaimed lands. And we can see in this landscape, if we look closely, that there's all kind of different groups. There's a lot of wind energy, there's agriculture, there's tourism, because Germany does not have a lot of coastline, so tourism is a really big part. There's just residents living in the area. Because it's all claimed land, there is a lot of, well, the whole land is diked. So coastal protection is a real big issue. And also conservation, because this area is almost, well, it's very similar to the Bay of Fundy. It has extreme tides, and there's a lot of birds, migratory birds coming by twice a year. And what we wanted to see is, okay, if we have an area where it's more local, so the context is local, can we influence then the more generalized, or how does a local context work with a generalized society? And so what I did in this study was I did a social network analysis, and I talked with representatives of these different sectors in the landscape. And I asked, okay, so who makes the decisions here? Who has the most power, if you want to say? And so the bigger the bubble, the more people said this person is influential, or like this group is influential. And so we see agriculture here as this big bubble, but also the municipalities, the counties, and tourism, and the wind industry. And the lines in between is the connections, how much they work together. And the color indicates how much they are connecting two bubbles, two nodes that are not connected. And so we see there is this whole center here that of municipalities and agriculture and tourism and counties and a little bit of environmental NGOs and the wind industry that work together and that seem to be quite influential, like perceived influence. And when we further talked and asked what is influence, people started talking about different things. Is it legal influence? Do you have the right, or is it the political influence? A lot of the people in the area were talking that agriculture, like a lot of farmers are also politicians. And then who owns the land? So you can imagine again that falls back to the farmers. But then a big issue was also money, that once you have money, you can do things. And that's, for example, how the wind industry came into play, because that's a big industry in Germany. But what we also found in this, when we talked, okay, so who's the most powerful? We always saw that others are seen as the ones with influence. So this is somebody from the state administration. So they execute the laws, they decide on subsidies in the area. And that's them. So it's super small bubble. They were like, no, we are not powerful. And they assigned the power to other units. But then we saw the same behavior, for example, in environmental NGOs. So they were like, yeah, no, we don't have any influence. It's other people that have influence. And so we saw that over and over again, that people were like, yeah, there's other people who have the influence to change things. And that despite that there is a really strong identity there for the people, and everybody said we try to find the best option for the area where we live, because we live in this area, right? And so we wanted to see what happens if we bring stakeholders together. And so we brought like stakeholders, like different actors in the landscape, different organizations. And so we did a workshop series with 14 experts coming from water management, coastal protection, the nature conservation groups, agriculture, political decision makers and administration, and also from tourism. And in the project, we had also modelers, climate modelers, and they created for this landscape. This is now just a illustration for a certain area, but they created these modelers. So based on the science, we created scenarios for the future. We said, okay, we can protect the land by building a dike, but not a natural dike, but like with walls. And you need to pump the land because the water is rising, sea levels rise, but you pump it out and you cannot sequester carbon. Or we said, okay, you can allow some of the rising water inside, you create some lakes, and there's some carbon sequestration. Or you do kind of a mix, you have these wetlands, you create wetlands that are carbon sequestered, and then you have to pump the land. And we wanted to know from them what would they prefer and what would happen. But what actually happened when we presented these results, basically, first we thought the process went wrong, because they were like, none of these. And they started talking about what they value, and they talked with each other. And they came up with an own suggestion of the area that combined different possibilities. And it's much greener than other areas. And they included some of these water bodies, and then we were like, okay, let's see. And our project went a whole other way than what we thought it would go forward. And then they said, okay, in this area, in this corner where we never had thought about, here we want a big lake that can be filled or used when we have like extreme rain events, but it also will get some of the water from this sea level rise. And it was a process. It took over 3 years and a lot of workshops, and we suddenly were like more these moderators. And what happened in the end for us was like, okay, we kind of didn't do what we wanted to do, but it's interesting, like in this paper, the finding is basically, well, actors do not agree with these extreme scenarios that we scientists think of, but of some mix. And then only 2 years later, the following happened. And this might not look like anything for you, but it was very interesting for us. So this is the official land use plan for the area. And it's very technical and very overlaid. But actually what is here in green is a new area that's this lake. So suddenly, because they were talking with each other, they found an agreement between the farmers that own the land and the county that does these plans, and the people that are representing nature conservation, that this area in the future will one of the flooding areas if you have high floods. And so we showed with this, it happened more or less as an accident, but that there is this space for policy making to adopt some of the context. But this is also only possible because these land use plans in this area in Germany are made on a county level and not on the provincial level, what would be the equivalent to provincial level. So to conclude my talk today, there's 3 messages I want to give you for the end. So on the context-specific perceptions, that individual human-nature relationships shape what we value and what we are willing thus to do or to change. And we really need to have an understanding of that to then change our societal trajectory pathway into this future. That policy frameworks need space for adaptation suiting the context. So as I said, only because the way this German land use planning works, only that's why we could see that the county implements this flooding area. And third is that the decision making needs to be more sensitive to different motivation, values, and perspectives. And we need to find ways to make them better heard. And a lot in sustainability science, people talk about participation, like that all these stakeholders should always come together. I think this is a really important step, but also it takes a lot of time. And I don't know if we have this time. So we need to think maybe about other ways and additional ways. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to hear questions now.